Wednesday night, the third one. Um, so if I remember correctly, last week we were talking about Aurobindo's life, and he had had an experience of nirvana, which is pretty much the culmination spot for most Hindus and Buddhists. But here he is as a young man, just having one, without much preparation at all. Anyway, I want to continue on. You'll see that he has quite a few more spiritual experiences which he has described. So by the time we're finished tonight, I think you'll have a pretty well-rounded view of who this guy is and why I've decided that it's important for Baha'is to know something about him. Anyway, so now I want to talk about his being incarcerated in a jail called Alipore. This was in 1908. Despite his recent spiritual realizations, Aurobindo continued his political activities after the Nirvana experience of January 1908. These activities had for some time been seen by the ruling British government as revolutionary rather than nationalistic in nature. When a number of violent expressions of this patriotic fervor occurred, the government was eager to stifle the source of the disturbances as quickly as possible. As the suspected leader of the nationalist movement, Aurobindo was arrested on May the 2nd, 1908, and incarcerated in the Alipore jail until May the 6th, 1909, for a full year as what's called an under trial prisoner. And you should know that Alipore is actually a suburb of Calcutta. So I'm going to show you some pictures here. So this is what it looks like nowadays. And this is his jail cell. This is the one he was in. Solitary confinement for almost the whole year. Far from being the hideous experience his enemies in the British government hoped it would be for him, Aurobindo's stay in this jail proved to be the turning point of his life. It provided him with a perfect opportunity to practice his spiritual disciplines, especially during those times he was placed in solitary confinement. All external distractions were thus removed from his life. He could now devote his full attention to divine contemplation. So Aurobindo spent much of his time reading and reciting the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and following their yogic instructions. He also practiced meditation of some form at virtually all other times. In due course, a transformation of his consciousness occurred. So let's just start at the beginning. I don't know if Gila is on. I didn't see. Is she there?
Who are you looking for?
Gila?
Not
on?
yet.
No, okay. All right, Durham, would you like to start us with our first reading here, please?
Sure. It was while I was walking that strength again entered. I looked at the jail that secluded me from men, and it was no longer by its high walls that I was imprisoned. No, it was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I walked under the branches of the tree in front of my cell, but it was not the tree. I knew it was Vasudeva. It was Krishna, whom I saw standing there and holding over me his shade. I looked at the bars of my cell, the very grating that did duty for a door, and again I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana who was guarding me and standing sentry over me, or I lay on the coarse blankets that were given me for a couch and felt the arms of Sri Krishna around me, the arms of my friend and lover. Speeches of Sri Aurobindo.
So Aurobindo later stated that Vasudeva is a name of Krishna. This also appears to be true of Narayana. This vision of Krishna was an intense experience of the personal Brahman. The Brahman with qualities, called Saguna Brahman, You'll remember the last time his nirvana experience was the Brahman without qualities, nirguna Brahman. So this Brahman with qualities is the divine which is immanent in creation or cosmic consciousness. His previous experience of the void, spaceless, timeless God of nirvana had not proved to be the final spiritual experience after all, as many people believe it should be. The impersonal Brahman, the Brahman without qualities, Nirguna Brahman, was apparently not the final goal of spiritual endeavor after all. Aurobindo would certainly agree that it is one goal, but not the ultimate goal. Under the pressure of his own experience, he was led to believe that Ramana Maharshi, that spiritual life only begins after nirvana. Maharshi was living at the same time as Aurobindo in the south of India. Only after the lower consciousness being stilled and focused is it possible for one to become an instrument for the divine will, he said. The calm of nirvana acts as the foundation on which is placed the new realm of spiritual experience, the hemisphere of divine manifestation. So these two experiences are reminiscent of, if not identical to, that of fana, annihilation, and baka, subsistence, in Islamic mysticism and the Baha'i faith. To my mind, the impersonal Brahman, Brahman without qualities, would appear to correspond with fana, the state of the passing away of the self as described by Baha'u'llah in the Valley of True Poverty and Absolute Nothingness. So Margaret, would you read our second reading for us, please?
This station is that of dying to the self and living in God, of being poor in self and rich in the desired one. Poverty, as here referred to, signifies being poor in that which pertaineth to the world of creation, and rich in what belongeth to the realms of God. Baha'u'llah, the Call of the Divine Beloved, the Seven Valleys.
Mm-hmm. So if true, the personal Brahman, Brahman with qualities, Saguna Brahman, would correspond to Baka, the state of returning to the world following this annihilation in God. Baha'u'llah describes it as the city of the heart. Suzanne, are you available for the third one?
Number 3. They who soar in the heaven of divine unity and attain the depths of the sea of detachment reckon this city, which is the station of life in God, as the loftiest state of the mystic knowers and the furthermost homeland of the faithful lovers. But to this evanescent one of the mystic, that word I'm not familiar with, evanescent, one of the mystic ocean. This station is the first gate of the heart's citadel. That is man's first entrance to the city of the heart. And the heart is endowed with 4 stages, which would be recounted should a kindred soul be found. Baha'u'llah, the Call of the Divine Beloved, the Seven Valleys.
Okay, so here you have compelling evidence that nirvana is not the end, that annihilation that scares us all when we read the seventh valley is just a dying to the limitations of the self that we've been carrying around to this point. But there's much to look forward to beyond that. So Aurobindo's meditative experiences in the jail of Alipore provided the final inspiration for him to devote his full attention to spiritual reality. David Erickson, are you there?
Could you unmute yourself, David?
Yeah. Is it number 3 or 4?
4, please.
That's what I thought, yeah. In the beginnings of the sadhana, spiritual practice, the idea was to take the divine help in the mission he had undertaken at Alipore. He decided to dedicate himself entirely to the spiritual life, and his outer life henceforward became a part of his sadhana and its result. The field of action also enlarged enormously afterwards. From the service of the country and its freedom, it became a worldwide it became a worldwide work touching intimately the future of humanity. Maybe Puritanic, the life of Sri Aurobindo.
So one of the things about this biography, The Life of Aurobindo by Purani, is that Purani was in Aurobindo's presence for about 35 or 40 years. So a lot of this is firsthand information. Okay, so the earlier balance that I described between politics and spiritual affairs in Aurobindo's life was irretrievably shifted to spiritual affairs during this time in jail. And it was to remain for the rest of his life as his primary concern. All the many gifts of his personality, including his massive intellect and indomitable will, were now completely aligned with and under the dominion of the divine. As one of his biographers describes him at this time, Aurobindo was, quote, a God-driven human instrument engaging in multiple tasks with a sense of preordained inevitability. When he was finally acquitted of the charges against him on May 6, 1909, he stepped out of jail radically different than the man who had entered. So about 3 weeks later, Aurobindo delivered his first public speech following his confinement. The so-called Uttarpara speech was his first public address concerning his spiritual life. Its emphasis and intention were quite different from those of his speeches in the previous year. Rather than encouraging political upheaval, he spoke of the quest of the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion of India, the spiritual religion behind the dogmatic quarrels of Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. He stated that the time had arrived when a solid foundation must be built on which the future independent India had to rest. Warning against an unthinking absorption of Western materialism with all its manifest faults, Aurobindo advised India to re-establish itself on its age-old cultural foundation, the eternal religion of the Vedas and Upanishads. This being India's true identity was also its greatest strength, and therefore would be its greatest gift to future world development. For India to look to any other country for its identity was foolhardiness. The opposing political forces were not pacified by Aurobindo's new style of public address. They remained suspicious of him, sensing hidden motives. Embittered by their fruitless attempts to censure his political activities, the British government was ever watchful of some new opportunity to ensnare Aurobindo again. He lived the next 9 months under a constant threat to his liberty. But all of a sudden, Aurobindo received an adesh, an inner command to leave Calcutta in secret. Okay, so let's see. Is Belinda there yet, David?
No, not yet.
Okay. How about Alan Fuller? Number 5.
In February 1910, less than a year after his coming out of Alipore, one evening in the office of Karma Yogan, Sri Bindo was warned that he was about to be arrested again and transported to the Andaman Islands. He heard the voice suddenly, which spoke distinctly 3 words. Go to Chandernagore. 10 minutes later, Sri Aurobindo took the first boat at dawn down the Ganges and was gone. This was the end of his political life, the end of the integral yoga, and the beginning of the supramental yoga.
Mark, are you going to explain the Karma Yogan?
Yeah, the Karma Yogan was a newspaper that he was directly involved in writing and also publishing. It was, I think, the second or third newspaper he got involved in. The others had been closed down by the British because of the so-called revolutionary activities. So very little is known of Aurobindo's inner life during the 6-week period, February 15th to March 31st of 1910, that he spent in Chandernagore. This is due to his almost incessant private meditation. His host in Chandernagore made the following observation, and I should say this is actually a suburb of Calcutta, not that far away. Okay, so I see that Belinda has just joined us. And if she wouldn't mind, maybe we could have her read number 6 for us.
Could you unmute Belinda?
Okay.
Great, thanks.
One felt that when he, or Aurobindo, spoke, as if somebody else was speaking through him. I placed the plate of food before him. He simply gazed at it, then ate a little, just mechanically. He appeared to be absorbed even when he was eating. He used to meditate with open eyes. And that's from A.V. Puran, The Life of Sri Aurobindo, page 132.
Okay. So let's see what he looked like at this point. There he is at the age of 39.
Okay.
So on March 31st of 1910, Aurobindo received another Adesh, another inner command, this time guiding him to Pondicherry, a French territory on the southeast coast of India. So I'm going to bring up that map again that I showed you before. Now, he was born in Calcutta up here on the eastern side. He spent many years working in Gujarat on the other side of the country, just north of Mumbai. And now he was going to go all the way down to Pondicherry. You see where Madras is, 3/4 of the way down the eastern side. Pondicherry is another, well, X number of miles south of that. Okay. It was a French territory at that point. So when he got there, then the English couldn't touch him, which was the whole point. Upon his arrival in April the 4th, Aurobindo immersed himself entirely in his sadhana. From this point until the end of his life, details of his personal spiritual disciplines, experience, and development are scant. One must rely on deduction and inference from his writings after 1910 to glimpse the contours of his personal development behind his third-person statements. But we have to exercise caution in this regard. Yes, his writings derive solely from his own experiences, but they are addressed to individual disciples, giving advice tailored to their particular situations. In such cases, the advice is not meant to be generalized to everyone. Aurobindo has left over 4,000 pages of evidence of his yogic practice and guidance from this period, much of which has been grouped by subject in later compilations and commented upon by individual followers of greater or lesser yogic achievement. One of the most difficult of all of these writings only became available about 5 years ago. It's called The Record of Yoga. These were personal notes that he took as a diary between 1909 and 1927. It's 1,515 pages in 2 volumes. Due to its cryptic nature and its extensive use of specialized terminology, no one has yet published any substantial study of the record of yoga to this point. So until someone comes to grips with the rich but enigmatic content of the record of yoga, it would be ill-advised to attempt to assign dates for any of his subsequent spiritual experiences, with 2 exceptions that I'll detail later this evening. The rest must remain private to Aurobindo, at least for now. He also spent a great deal of his time when he was not seeing people, which extended for years, but he encouraged his disciples to write down their questions and leave them for him. And every night he would attempt to answer them. And this would go on till 3, 4, 5 in the morning. It would take him so long, partly because he wrote such extensive answers. So these are now gathered in 4 volumes, 2,529 pages. And these are letters to individual disciples. And you'll see later that I'm quoting from quite a few of these, where it seems to be that we can generalize some of the statements. So shortly after settling in his sanctuary at Pondicherry, disciples gradually came to Aurobindo seeking spiritual guidance. By the time of his death 40 years later, these numbered as many as 750 resident disciples. During certain periods of his life, particularly in the 1930s, his followers were encouraged to write down their questions and concerns about their sadhana. Each night, Aurobindo would take the time, often writing until dawn, to respond to every message. His responses made public the fruits of his own spiritual labor, sometimes at considerable length. This continuous back and forth correspondence expanded his awareness of the experiences of this growing group of explorers, extending the horizons of his knowledge to what we might call spiritual geography in the process. The fact that Aurobindo had many subsequent spiritual experiences beyond those documented in the Synthesis of Yoga, which I'd mentioned before, which he completed in 1921, becomes clear in his final work, Savitri, a vast poem of almost 25,000 lines. He used this poem as a record of his yogic practice, updating it whenever he ascended to a higher level of consciousness. I think some of the sections have been rewritten 15 times or more. So the final version, which he tells us was finally composed at the level of the overmind, which won't mean much to you right now, but it will later, was completed shortly before his death in 1950, just 2 or 3 weeks before. So we'll talk about this higher level of mind in a future class. Despite the predominantly secluded nature of Aurobindo's life after 1910, there are a handful of external circumstances which may be seen as either capable of affecting his consciousness in some way or as possibly indicating different stages in his inner development. Now I'm going to bring up the chronology that I handed out last week. If we go to the 3rd page, yeah. So here's, I've got February 1910, he escapes to Chandernagore. Then in April, he goes to Pondicherry. Now this is interesting. April of 1910, Paul Richard made his first visit to Pondicherry to meet Sri Aurobindo. And I'm not quite sure of the date here, whether it was before that or after. Mira Alfassa marries Paul Richard in Paris. So she's due to become the collaborator of Aurobindo a little later in her life. But at this point, she was entering her 2nd marriage. Her first marriage had ended sometime before this. And you'll see that she begins writing something that is later called Prayers and Meditations, some of which reflect her dream experience with Aurobindo. And then in March of 1914, she embarks for India, and on March 29th, finally meets the man of her dreams. So let's see what she looks like at this point. There she is. She's in, this picture I think was taken slightly later, but she's wearing Oriental clothes. She's living in Japan at the time when this was taken. Oh, so let me go back here. So the first meeting of Mira Richard, wife of Paul Richard, and Sri Aurobindo on March 24th, 1914, brought her face to face with the man she had dreamt of numerous times, the man she identified as Krishna. Her diary entry from the morning after their initial encounter records her evaluation of his spiritual stature. I think I saw Lori on there somewhere. Would you mind reading 7?
Yes, certainly. It matters little that there are thousands of beings plunged in the densest ignorance. He whom we saw yesterday is on earth. His presence is enough to prove that a day will come when darkness shall be transformed into light, and thy reign shall be indeed established upon earth, the mother collected works.
And the thy here is referring to God. Okay, so she's seeing a direct connection between God and Aurobindo. The event was mutually momentous. So here's what Aurobindo had to say about actually, I don't think he actually said it, but this is what one of his biographers said as a way of summarizing what had happened. Is Heather online?
Heather's here, yes.
Okay, Heather, take it away for number 8.
Okay, Aurobindo realized that he had met the first of his disciples, the great collaborator who was to become the marvelous executrix, the Shakti, the Kali, the mother of Sri Aurobindo's supramental yoga, K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, in the biography of Aurobindo.
Mm-hmm. It's quite a massive book, this one, and I've used it quite a bit to understand what was going on in this guy's complex life. So it's likely that the true nature of her future role was hidden from Mira until her return to Pondicherry in 1920, following a 6-year hiatus spent in France and Japan. From 1920 onward, she was to act more and more fully as Aurobindo's external manifestation, as the expression of his power in the created world. In their own estimation, the two physical individuals were one person. Aurobindo was the master Krishna of pure existence, while the mother was his power, Kali, power of consciousness. It was the combined enthusiasm and persuasiveness of Paul and Mira Richard that prevailed upon Aurobindo to set down his conception of reality in a philosophical format. The 3-way decision to publish a bilingual journal in English and French was reached on June 1st, 1914. Although he had never previously written any philosophy, Aurobindo felt compelled to accede to their request in view of his expressed contention that a yogi ought to be able to turn his head to anything. The resulting journal, entitled Arya, A-R-Y-A, commenced publication on Aurobindo's 42nd birthday, August 15th, 1914, just 2 weeks after the declaration of World War I in Europe. It had 2 stated objectives: to provide a systematic study of the highest problems of existence, and 2, to form a vast synthesis of knowledge, harmonizing the diverse religious traditions of humanity, Occidental as well as Oriental. Its format allowed Aurobindo the scope he required to express his spiritual vision in a comprehensive and coherent fashion. His entry into the philosophical form proved to be sophisticated and awe-inspiring. The initial issue of the Arya included first installments of what would eventually be published as The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga, The Secret of the Veda, and Aurobindo's translation of the Isha Upanishad. The manner in which he was able to write several books at the same time in serial format over 6 years testifies to his openness to a level of consciousness beyond that of the ordinary mind. Here is how the mother described his process of writing. How about you, Ingrid? So number 9.
Okay. I am going to give you two examples to make you understand what true spontaneity is. One, you all know about it undoubtedly, is of the time Sri Aurobindo began writing the Arya in 1914. It was neither a mental knowledge nor even a mental creation which he transcribed. He silenced his mind and sat at the typewriter. And from above, from the higher planes, all that had to be written came down, all ready. And he had only to move his fingers on the typewriter, and it was transcribed. It was in this state of mental silence, which allows the knowledge and even the expression from above to pass through, that he wrote the whole Arya with its 64 printed pages a month. This is why, besides, he could do it, for if it had been a mental work of construction, it would have been quite impossible.
So I think you'll come to see as we read some of the selections from the Life Divine and the synthesis of yoga particularly, the validity of what's being said here, that this is not something that you could come up with on your own, struggling away, having to do 6 of these at the same time. 6 books with a totally different focus in each case. The Life Divine is almost 1,200 pages long. The synthesis of yoga ended up to be on 860 or so. It's a staggering achievement. The more you read what he has written, the more you'll buy into what's being said here. So let's see what he looked like at his writing table. This is about that age during the time when he was writing for the Arya. Almost all his greatest literary works were introduced on a monthly basis within Arya's pages. In addition to the 4 texts already mentioned, Aurobindo also penned essays on the Gita, the ideal of human unity, the psychology of social development, which is now known as the human cycle. The sheer volume of the material, to say nothing of its superlative quality, is staggering. One's amazement is deepened when one realizes that the Arya ceased publication in January 1921, a scant 6.5 years later. Aurobindo had emphatically demonstrated the truth of his conviction that a yogi ought to be able to turn his head to anything.
Mark,
Yes.
here has a question. What is the meaning of Arya? Do you know?
Well, it's the same word we get the word Aryan from. There's that sense of pureness. Actually, you know, I'm not even 100% certain. Let me see if I can find that for you right now.
Oops, sorry, didn't want to interrupt.
I looked it up. It means noble.
Oh, noble.
And there was a few other things, but noble seemed to be
That's
the
a good one.
Yeah.
Did you hear that, Mark?
Yes, I did. Of course, this doesn't have it. Okay, so noble sounds like a great translation. Thank you. That's the question you didn't expect to have to answer. That's not, what can I say? Okay. So I want to talk about the temporary separation between Mira Richard and Aurobindo from 1915 to 1920. With the outbreak of World War I, the Richards were called back to France. Actually, let me pull up the chronology again. Mira left Pondicherry for France February 22nd of 1915 and left Aurobindo with the task of producing the Arya on his own. And I think at that point the translation efforts kind of fell apart. So if you don't mind, we just refer to some of the parts of the chronology to cover the periods in a sketchy kind of way. So let's see here. We've got, so here's she, this is where Mira is. This is not, oh, there we go. Okay, she leaves Pondicherry, and then you start to see some of the books that are being published. Then the first installments of the essays on the Gita and the human cycle show up in 1916. The first installment of a book called The Future Poetry that I think certain people in this audience would be interested in are here. He wrote an article called Is India Civilized?, which showed up in Foundations of Indian Culture. So he was analyzing the culture itself. And then in the midst of this, his wife dies in Calcutta. They were childless. I don't know how many days they were together in their entire married life. He was on the road so much during his political period, and then he moved to the southern part of the country where she was not. So I can't say she must have had a very happy life. Okay, by 1920 in April, Mira has been in Japan for several years and finally leaves and comes to Pondicherry and starts to live in the guest house in the compound that they have there. Okay, when she landed at Pondicherry in April 1920, this time to stay, the mother rapidly assumed more and more of Aurobindo's responsibility for the spiritual guidance of the growing number of his disciples. Let me see here. So as I mentioned, the last issue of the Arya came out in January of 1921. A year later, the mother takes charge of the whole of the household, which is considerable by this period. In October, they moved to a residence down the street, I guess it is, which is the present ashram building. And then 1922-26 is the period that is covered by A.B. Pirani's book, Evening Talks. It's a 750-page book. Intimate glimpses of things that he was thinking and the disciples were asking his advice about. So early in 1926, in an effort to facilitate his own spiritual development, Aurobindo entrusted the mother with complete control over his ashram, both the outer management and the spiritual direction. The move heightened the disciples' anticipation of a major spiritual development in their guru, and it was not long in coming. So why don't we stop there for a moment and break off the recording and start up a